Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the Post 110. Every good artist makes their audience uncomfortable. The life, living and death of Andrea Gibson. I've been planning this post for one of our magical zero ending posts for quite some time, but Andrea Gibson died between post 100 and yes, 110. And so using and summoning their life and their spirit and their creativity seemed appropriate today. But can I also say this is a post that does something else as well? It activates an understanding of research and reading cultures and the transformations to our reading cultures. Particularly we look at post-reading, but more of that later. Poetry is quite important to this post, and it's quite important to life for many reasons. But poetry's gained a new life and a new energy and great diversity through the arrival of the e-book. And about 15 years ago, yes, I am that close to death, about 15 years ago, I wrote an article for the Times Higher Education exploring how digitisation and the e-book would radically transform publishing and radically transform the diversity of what we read. Now, I was actually, for once, right, absolutely right on that. And through e-publishing, the diversity of what we can read now is just magnificent. But the tragedy is, even though I was right, that since I wrote that article 15, 16 years ago, reading rates of humans around the world have plummeted. So I'm going to do a post on post-reading at some point, and I've been doing research on that for about 2 years. So we've never had such an opportunity to read such diversity of genres and diversity of authors. But for some reason, at this point in our history, so many citizens in so many nations are deciding that they do not want to read. And reading is a choice. So anything that provides a pathway back to reading, I think we all have to acknowledge and support and welcome. And this week, we're going to talk about the role of the late, great Andrea Gibson and their role in rejuvenating poetry and the systems and the structures, including social media, that enlivened that connection with poetry. It's such an important story. But I also want to finish this post with a discussion about poetry itself. Now, I know we've got engineers and actors, we've got social workers and physiotherapists, pick a discipline. All of us are part of this community, and we have colleagues from all around the world, 100 plus nations. We are a diverse community, and I love you for that, and I thank you for 10 years of walking with me. But whatever our discipline today, whatever nation you are in, hello, let's take a moment and honour Andrea Gibson, and let's turn our minds for just the next 25 minutes or so to the capacity of poetry to enliven reading cultures. To cite Gibson's poem, quote, "It's okay, everybody's survival looks a bit like death sometimes," end of quote. So Andrea Gibson was born on August 13, 1975 in a small town, Calais in Maine, and they died on July 14, 2025. They graduated from St. Joseph's College in Maine, and that is a Catholic private university in Maine. And Gibson graduated with a degree in English. And I think that's also pretty important for this week too. There's so much bad stuff happening around the world at the moment, discrediting English as a degree. And yet it is, and I did my second degree in English and literature, can I say so? So I've got a bit of skin in this game. The gift of an English degree, not only in terms of critique, but in terms of creativity, we have to acknowledge and we have to support. Now, Gibson received hundreds of obituaries and accolades after their death, and the first posthumous biography appeared about a week after their death, written by Connor Blake and titled The Unapologetic Heart. Now, I've put that in the reference list. Can I say, when I was checking all my references yesterday, that book has, inverted commas, disappeared. So I'm not quite sure what's happened there, but a biography has been written. It was okay, but at this point, let's see what's happened with its publication. Interesting, eh? So what makes Gibson famous, I think, was their capacity to summon vulnerability, but vulnerability with hope, and crafting poetry as a statement of strength and sharing with an audience. Gibson was known as a poet, but that is far too simple, I think. And this is where I'm terribly interested. This is how I discovered Gibson. Gibson has done the really hard yakka, the really difficult work to connect poetry with popular culture. Of course, winning multiple poetry slams, but committing to social media as an interface for poetry, particularly with really innovative uses of Instagram, YouTube, and Substack. Brilliant. They wrote of the private, they wrote of the political, and did the hard work to connect them. But through the tragedy of Gibson being diagnosed with ovarian cancer, the sickness, the grief, and yes, even the death was used to teach others about love, about mortality, and about beauty. Now, there are plenty of poets in the world. There are plenty of great poets in the world. But Gibson's role was different. It was transformative. It was transcendent. Prizing open those spaces between the private and the political, life and death, love and war. The Andrea Gibson story, I think, speaks of the importance of context as well, the importance of place-based support for the development of creativity. In 1999, they moved to Boulder, Colorado. This is important. Boulder, Colorado is a very, very special place. The only equivalent, I would argue, in the United States is Austin, Texas. These are university towns, lots of universities, and they're such great places to live that people go there to go to university, and then the graduates stay. But also what makes these places important is there are a lot of cheap places to perform. So lots of live venues, cheap places to live. So that allows people to really enjoy the experience, and lots of venues to perform. And can I say, in both these places, in Austin and in Boulder, there is local, regional, state-based and national support for what's going on in these locations. And I'm talking, yes, money as well as policy. So there is a gift of having a place and places to perform. It meant that Gibson had multiple opportunities and interfaces to present their poetry. And these interfaces started to be meshed with really unusual ways and modes of expression. Now, Gibson's poetry very, very rarely shows the conventional structures that we expect of poetry. There's no real classical meter here. There's no rhyming scheme. The voice creates the rhythm. And the poetry is an embodied rhythm, the rhythm of a body, the rhythm of breath. The published poetry through their career is substantial. 7 books of poetry have been released. You Better Be Lightning, and I love these books, can I say? You Better Be Lightning, Lord of the Butterflies, Take Me With You, Pansy, The Madness Vase, and Pole Dancing to Gospel Hymns, which was the first book of poetry. Now, one of those books was published by Penguin, and of course Penguin has a long, long heritage, a century-long heritage of commitment to poetry. But the other books come from 2 great publishers that I discovered through Gibson, and I'm a big fan. So these publishers are Button Poetry and Write Bloody Publishing. Small publishers, and I think it's important that all of us support them. They're very active in social media, so please support them. But also these small presses are doing a great service for the planet. So let's support them when we can. But significantly, Gibson also produced 7 albums of poetry, and they're available on Apple. And can I say, as of last night, one more track was added last night. There are 5 tracks of Gibson on Spotify. 5. So if you want a sort of taster, they're on Spotify. Now, the albums were Bullets and Wind Chimes, Swarm, When the Bough Breaks, Yellow Bird, Flower Boy, Truce, and my personal favourite album, if you're going to buy an album, buy Hey Galaxy. It's terrific. So this combination of the spoken word and publishing is really unusual, and it's interesting. The voice leads print, print leads voice. Fascinating. And I would argue there's a lot of innovative multimodal strategies that Gibson has deployed that we can use in our own career, in our own life, when we are thinking about dissemination. Now, prizes did follow their innovation. They won the first Women of the World Poetry Slam in 2008 and a 2-time winner of the Independent Publishers Award in 2021 and 2019. And importantly, they were appointed the Poet Laureate of Colorado, and in 2024 received an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship. So these accolades certainly confirm a remarkable career and only, I think, intensify the profound tragedy of the death in 2025. The feedback through their professional lives and certainly after their death was profound. Poets have a very, very different connection with their audience, and we can all learn from it, I think, particularly when we compare it to other literary forms or other popular cultural forms. It's a very intimate relationship. It's very, very hot. It's very, very engaged. And for the LGBTQ plus community, Gibson provided language and space to understand life and love and desire and hope. To provide 2 lines from Gibson's poetry confirming this value, and I must not get upset, these lines do stay with me every single day. Quote, "Nothing hurts more than living someone else's life," end of quote, and quote, "The hardest people in the world to forgive are the people we once were," end of quote. For those with terminal illnesses as well, Gibson narrated sickness in a way that was meaningful and powerful, and this honesty and this connection was built in and through a place. Poetry has a context, and this is important for me, how we understand how a city enables poets. Important. Their directness, their honesty, their vulnerability found a large audience in Boulder for spoken word poetry. Now, Boulder is a great example of a city that committed to art, that committed to creativity, that committed to live performance. And Gibson gained through that commitment and was also incredibly honest as they moved from a queer identification in the late 1990s to genderqueer and then a non-binary identifying citizen. Living beyond binaries, beyond clean categories, Gibson taught the world. It was an andragogical functionality to talk about the life of being a non-binary identifying human. Andrea Gibson taught the world, and also showed the differences and the dissonances between identity, desire, and behaviour. In the poem Andrew, this fluidity is performed. Quote, "I want to grow into something that nobody's ever seen before, and gender is just one of those ways in which we are boxed in and labelled." End of quote. Poetry therefore became a political tool. It always has been a political tool. The personal was political, but also the writing about anxiety and trauma and depression. Gibson really has a lot in common with Emily Dickinson, with Sylvia Plath obviously, but also Mary Oliver in particular. You see, all left space, left room in their stanzas for diverse humans to find solace, compassion, and company. To quote Gibson's great poem, What Sucks About the Afterlife, quote, "On earth, everyone loves butterflies, but I trusted the caterpillars more. I trusted the ones who knew they were not done with growing." End of quote. All these poets, the great poets, cling to the fragility of life. And Gibson made a decision to announce their cancer diagnosis in 2021, announced it on a podcast and talked about it, and continue to talk about life and death through their work. And the remarkable documentary Come See Me in the Good Light, released in 2025, was released just before their death, and I recommend it to you. The poetry about death and dying was astonishing. In Love Letter from the Afterlife, Gibson wrote, quote, "Dying is the opposite of leaving. When I left my body, I did not go away. That portal of light was not a portal to elsewhere, but a portal to here. I am more here now than I have ever been." End of quote. The power of this vulnerability, this honesty, activates emotions like a feather grazing our skin. They left us with a question that I carry with myself every day. Quote, "Are you living like you are dying? Are you fighting like you are living?" End of quote. Or put more directly, quote, "I'm gonna run death like a stop sign." End of quote. But in this time of sickness, in September 2023, Governor Jared Polis appointed Andrea Gibson Colorado's Poet Laureate, valuing not only excellence in poetry, but also, as part of the citation, was community service to poetry. So poetry has a key function because it opens out spaces that we don't know as spaces. It slows us down. It makes us conscious of our breath. It allows us to sit in a space and see the world in a different way. Poetry plays a very unusual role in citizenship and in belonging structures, and Gibson and their partner Megan Falley wrote a great book in 2019 that I recommend to you, How Poetry Can Change Your Heart. Great book. The benefits of poetry that they outlined included seeing the world through someone else's perspective, quote, "in showing up as witnesses to the lives and stories of others," end of quote. But they also recognised the light and portable nature of a poetry book and the capacity to value and revalue and appreciate the everyday in our lives. They also valued the diversity of poetry, performance poetry and spoken word poetry, as well as published books and textual environments online. They asked all of us that we, quote, "write every day for 10 minutes, end of quote. And while I value that sentiment and that directive enormously, I would like to correct that a little bit. I would like us all to read every day for 10 minutes. And let me tell you why, and this is where this post starts to twist a bit. Let me share with you precisely what's happening on this planet right now. Let me share with you some national studies and investigations on reading. and to show you why the conversation we are having today, this is a hot conversation, the conversation that we are having today matters so much. In 2022, the National Arts Participation Survey in Australia showed that reading rates were declining in all age groups and all genres of books and publishing and reading. Only 9% of women and 7% of men had read any poetry in the last year. That becomes important. Any poetry in the last year. 9% of women, 7% of men. Now, that's a pretty astonishing statistic, particularly when I think about my father, wonderful Big Kev is still alive, 97 years of age. And as I grew up, poetry was quoted in the house all the time. My father, basically lived through C.J. Dennis's The Sentimental Bloke. Peanuts and lollies, says the boys upstairs. This was part of daily life, right? And think about Banjo Paterson and The Man from Snowy River, published in 1890 and sold 7,000 copies in the first 3 months of publication. Okay, 1890. Now in Australia, poetry right now is published in very, very small presses. I have enormous respect for them, but very small presses, very small distribution. So that means that these poetry books are selling hundreds, not thousands of copies. Now, what the hell has caused this? Now, one cause is that Australian teachers have been reported, this has been researched, Australian teachers have reported that they don't have the confidence to teach poetry in schools. So teacher education, and again remember I'm a former head of school of teacher education, tragically too often called teacher training, my goodness me, it must change. It must enable confidence in the teaching of poetry. And can I say why this is so bizarre is the pedagogy and the andragogy to teach poetry you can probably do in about 4 hours. So an intervention is possible. And also we can follow the example of Norway and Aotearoa, New Zealand in particular, governments committing to buying poetry books and putting them into school libraries. Yep. But the current Australian government has promised some change. They're going to appoint, supposedly, this year, an Australian Poet Laureate. Still waiting to see it come on. And look, that may start some transformation, might start some dialogue and discussion. But of course, this is not only an Australian problem. Dire news emerged also in a 2022 study in the United States. Only 9.2% of US citizens acknowledged to reading any poetry in the last year. That does expand to 12% when listening to social media listening to poetry on social media interfaces is incorporated. So that's interesting. The figure lifts. Poetry listening was a new survey question in the United States in 2022. So we're going to have to wait some years to see the longitudinal data set and analysis to see the impact of that question. So the decline in reading in the United States, and decline particularly in poetry reading, was found in the 18 to 24 year age group and those over 75. But what is intriguing in the US data set, and this is where the rubber meets the road here. What's intriguing in the US data set is that poetry reading increases with the education of the reader. So in other words, the more educated the human, the more likely they are to read poetry. That's significant. But education level is not a meaningful correlation when we're talking about listening to poetry. How crucial is this? So that's why you see listening to poetry matters so much. But we now have to create, and this is challenging work to do, we now have to create the multimodal scaffolding between listening and reading. That will not happen naturally. We have to create andragogical and pedagogical strategies to scaffold that movement. Now, there is one particular nation that is bucking this narrative trend of decline. Jordan Hamill, in the same period as these studies in Australia and the United States, reported the popularity of reading in Aotearoa, New Zealand, through the National Reading Survey. And hang on to yourself, here we go. 25% of New Zealanders reported to have read a book of poetry, not a poem, a book of poetry in the previous year. 25%. And what makes the statistic even more astonishing is half of those readers reported reading a New Zealand poet. And this statistic gets even more amazing. The highest percentage of readers of New Zealand poets was in the 10 to 17 age group. And just to add the unbelievable nature to this statistic, men read more New Zealand poetry than women. Now, what's going on here? Well, Hamill, a Wellington-based poet, has argued that what's happened in New Zealand is there's been a broadening of genres, and the use of social media has created all these new interfaces for poetry. So Insta poets abound. But the argument about New Zealand growth is based on diversity. The diversity of poets means that readers and listeners see themselves in the poetry. So we've suddenly got new spaces for listening, for reading, and for living. Now, a few humans can make a sustainable living being a poet. W.H. Auden stated, quote, "It's a sad fact of our culture that a poet can earn more money writing or talking about his art than practicing it," end of quote. And most poets have a day job or they teach somewhere in the system. Now, Norway once more is different. Respect to Norway. Norway once more is different. There is a governmental salary to be a poet, and the Arts Council purchases books of poetry and puts them in libraries. So poetry in Norway is a national priority. And indeed, as I've done the research for the post this week, you can certainly see why it is important for literacy. My argument today, colleagues, is that poetry is incredibly important to intervene and interrupt this decline in reading, because poetry slows us down, it creates space around the words. We pause and reflect, and in a busy, busy life, poetry gives us the opportunity to wander. Think about our spaces differently. Poetry requires a context. It requires a place where poets are supported, where they can perform, where they can publish. And a diversity of interfaces now are connecting readers with writers, and that's tremendous. Now, for me, Andrea Gibson is the archetype, the example that we all should be following, and a multimodal blessing. And they demonstrated the gift on YouTube, on Instagram, on Substack. But there must be support, there must be support for culture, for writing. And that support comes from cities and regions and states and provinces and nations. Poetry is a gateway to reading. And look, I've always carried poetry books in my handbag, basically since I was a teenager. And I carried T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets in my handbag between the ages of 25 and 45. You know, and whenever I had a gap in my life, when I was waiting, I was on a bus, I was on a train, I was at an airport, whenever there was a gap in my life, I simply pull it out of my handbag. And I had to put T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets out of my handbag because when I turned 46, Little Gidding just got a little bit too hot and personal for me. But the gift, I think, of the Kindle now is that even after Gibson's death, they are still with us. We can still carry that poetry around with us. You see, poetry is always there when we need it. And you know what? Poetry is always there, even when we don't know that we need it. So it seems appropriate to finish this post with a poem from Gibson, Birthday. And Gibson showed in the capacity of 3 lines to tell us about trauma and tragedy and loss and despair and hope. Quote, "I know our wounds seem as deep as the Atlantic, but every ocean has a shoreline, and every shoreline has a tide." End of quote. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.